Rain fell in relentless sheets over the landing platform of Icarus Station, turning the metal surfaces into slick mirrors that reflected the dim glow of the station's lights. The wind howled through the skeletal supports of the platform, carrying the scent of ozone and heated alloys. Dr. Nathaniel Nate Wainwright stood at the edge, his gloved hands gripping the railing as if it could anchor him against the storm and the unease gnawing at the pit of his stomach. He had been summoned with no explanation. No dossier. No hint of what or who he would face, only the cryptic message blinking across the comm console of his shuttle: human doctor required. Condition critical. Arrival immediate. The words had arrived hours ago, stark and impersonal, yet heavy with urgency. And now, standing on the platform with the storm whipping around him, he knew this was no ordinary medical emergency. A shuttle cut through the rain like a silver arrow, its thrusters flaring as it approached the station. Sparks of condensation danced in the glow, and the hiss of the landing struts echoed through the otherwise silent corridors. Nate's pulse quickened. The message had not prepared him for this. Whatever was coming would be unlike anything he had ever treated. The hatch hissed open. Steam rolled out, mingling with the storm as if the universe itself were exhaling. And then she stepped out. She was humanoid, yes, but delicate, more delicate than any human, any known species. Her skin seemed almost translucent, luminous under the harsh lights, like moonlight pressed into living flesh. Every movement was cautious, precise, a fragile ballet against the platform's slick surface. And then Nate saw it, a wound, subtle but deeply intimate, hidden in a place that spoke of vulnerability and trust. It was not just physical, it radiated an almost palpable sense of pain, and yet she moved as if guarding it with every ounce of her being. Lieutenant Marla Jensen, the officer assigned to escort her, came forward, her voice clipped and urgent over the roar of the storm. "Dr. Wainwright," she said, tension threading through every syllable. "She's unstable. The wound, it's unlike anything our medtech can handle. Only you, human, can treat her. No one else can." Nate swallowed, his throat tight. This was unprecedented. He had treated exotic diseases, injuries from zero-gravity accidents, even the rare case of a hybrid species, but never had he been summoned as the only option for an alien patient. He studied her for a moment, noting the faint tremor in her limbs, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. She was trying not to show it, but fear and pain clung to her like a shadow. Her eyes opened, and Nate felt his chest tighten. They were impossibly blue depths of stormy ocean contained in living crystal. They regarded him with intelligence, wariness, and a raw vulnerability that cut straight through the professional detachment he had built over decades. She tried to speak, but the sounds that escaped her lips were musical, haunting, incomprehensible to human ears. She pointed to the wound, then to him, as if confirming what the message had already said: only he could heal her. They moved swiftly toward the med bay, but Nate could feel the tension radiating from her with every careful step. Each movement was a negotiation between fragility and necessity, a delicate dance in which one misstep could unravel the trust she was tentatively placing in him. Nate's mind raced with questions. How could a wound be species-specific? How could a human touch be the key to healing? The med bay was cold, bright, and sterile, everything a hospital room should be, yet completely alien in atmosphere when hosting this patient. Machines hummed softly, scanning, recording, monitoring, but Nate knew that no device could replicate what was required here. No technology could reach the depth of pain, the subtle physiology that he now faced. She reclined on the medical table, and Nate knelt beside her, his hands hovering over the wound with a mixture of awe and professional caution. Her body shivered slightly, a silent plea for gentleness. He recognized that her vulnerability was both physical and emotional. She had been hurt in ways that transcended the tissue and skin he could see. "Okay," Nate whispered to himself, almost more for courage than instruction. "We can do this." His gloved hands made contact for the first time, tentative, exploratory. The wound was delicate, almost responsive, his pulse, his breathing, even his emotional state seemed to influence the tiny fissure in her flesh. He adjusted his touch, letting his empathy guide him, aware that one wrong motion could worsen the trauma. Each movement became a conversation, silent yet intimate, a negotiation of trust and fear. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional sigh or the low hum of machines. He worked methodically, cleaning, stitching, monitoring responses that were almost conscious, as if her body itself were aware of the stakes. The complexity of her physiology was staggering. Her tissues reacted not just to physical stimuli but to his own presence, his steadiness, his confidence. It was as though the act of healing had become a shared experience, a delicate interplay between patient and doctor. Gradually, imperceptibly, she began to relax. The tension in her shoulders eased, the tremor in her limbs slowed. Nate's heart, already burdened with a sense of responsibility heavier than any he had carried before, lifted slightly. The wound was stabilized, not fully healed, but safe enough to continue recovery with careful attention. Lieutenant Jensen's voice, hesitant and relieved, broke the stillness. "Dr. Wainwright, she's stable." "You did it." Nate nodded, though he did not look away from her. He realized that this was only the beginning. The wound was physical, yes, but it was also emotional, psychological, and possibly cultural. Healing her would demand more than medicine. It would demand patience, empathy, and a willingness to step into an alien world and earn trust in the purest, most human way. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and in that small motion, Nate saw the first flicker of relief. It was a quiet victory, yet monumental. He understood then that the lines between healer and confidant, doctor and companion, had already begun to blur. And as the rain began to ease outside the med bay, leaving the platform gleaming beneath the softening dawn, Nate realized the weight of what lay ahead, the challenge of not just mending flesh, but of touching a being's very essence and perhaps, discovering something about himself in the process. The corridors of Icarus Station were quiet now, the storm of memory etched into slick metal and fading puddles. Yet the silence felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Dr. Nate Wainwright guided her carefully down the hallway to a private suite that had been converted for her recovery, a space filled with soft light, subtle warmth, and the hum of life support systems. She moved with precision, her delicate frame almost dancing over the slick floor, but every step radiated caution. Nate's heart ached to see her so guarded, yet he knew that this caution was born of survival. The wound had been stabilized, yet he could feel that the real challenge was only beginning. Healing her would not be a matter of sutures and antiseptics, it would require patience, empathy, and an understanding that spans species, culture, and consciousness. Over the next days, he learned to read her gestures, her subtle signs. A tap of a fingertip indicated discomfort, a tilt of the head suggested curiosity. She had begun to recognize his presence, following his movements with wide, luminous eyes that seemed to contain galaxies. Communication was painstaking but rewarding. Nate spoke softly, narrating his actions, describing the sounds of the station, and explaining each procedure. Every word was measured, deliberate, and meant to comfort. Sometimes, she would flinch at the slightest touch, and he would pause, waiting until her body relaxed before resuming. He realized that trust was the true medicine here. Every moment they shared was a silent dialogue, each touch a promise that she would not be hurt again. The bond between them deepened quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it became as vital as the air they breathed in the hermetically sealed suite. One night, under the soft artificial starlight projected onto the ceiling, she reached for him, not out of need, but out of choice. Her hand, fragile and trembling, brushed his arm, and the gesture was electric. Nate's chest tightened. He realized then that this was no longer merely a patient under his care. She had begun to see him as a presence she could rely on, perhaps even trust implicitly, and that trust was far more fragile and precious than any wound he had treated. He began to understand her physiology in ways that textbooks could never capture. Her body seemed almost sentient, responding to his calm, measured attention with subtle shifts in temperature and tone. Pain, he discovered, was not simply physical, it was intertwined with memory, fear, and isolation. Healing her meant navigating these layers, coaxing her into safety with gentleness and consistency. Some nights were the hardest. She would wake, restless and tense, and Nate would sit by her side, speaking softly in English, letting her hear the cadence of his voice as if it were a lullaby. Gradually, she learned a few words, repeating them with effort and concentration. Her first fully intelligible phrase startled him. Nate, she spoke it as though testing the sound, tasting the word as much as pronouncing it. It was a bridge between their worlds, a small yet profound acknowledgement that she recognized him as a human, and that he mattered. Her progress was slow, but undeniable. She began to move with confidence again, exploring the sweet, touching surfaces, observing the subtle architecture of the station. Nate watched her with a mixture of awe and caution. Every step forward carried the weight of her fragility, and yet every step was a triumph, a testament to resilience he had never imagined. One afternoon, she gestured toward the observation deck. Nate followed, unsure of what she intended. The twin suns of Kepler 438b cast long shadows over the station, bathing the metal in gold and rose hues. She stood at the edge, hands pressed together, gazing out into the void. Nate joined her silently. She turned, and their eyes met. There was a wordless understanding in her gaze, a gratitude deeper than language. She reached for his hand again, this time with steady assurance, not hesitation. Nate took it, feeling the warmth and fragility of her touch. In that instant, he understood something profound. Healing was no longer about the wound that had brought her here. It was about connection, trust, and the courage to open oneself to another being. Weeks passed. The wound was gone, leaving no trace of its earlier severity, but the emotional and psychological scars remained, subtler yet more significant. Nate continued to sit by her side, teaching her about human concepts, and learning from her about resilience and adaptation in ways no medical journal could convey. Each day was a negotiation, a careful balance between guiding her toward normalcy and respecting her innate delicacy. Then came the day she prepared to leave. The shuttle awaited, engines humming softly, ready to carry her back into the endless void. Nate helped her with final preparations, ensuring she was fully capable of travel. She turned to him, her eyes glimmering with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something indefinable, an emotion that transcended human vocabulary. Her hand found his again, gripping firmly, not as a patient seeking reassurance, but as a being expressing acknowledgement, connection, and perhaps even friendship. "You saved me," she said in careful English, her voice trembling slightly. Nate shook his head gently, a smile breaking across his face despite the exhaustion that weighed him down. "You saved yourself," he replied softly. "I just helped." The shuttle lifted off, carrying her into the dark expanse, leaving only the hum of the station and the memory of her presence. Nate stood alone on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars as they shimmered against the infinite black. The lesson lingered with him: some healing goes beyond the body. It touches the soul, it requires empathy, patience, and courage. And sometimes, only a human guided by compassion and understanding can bridge that distance. As the station rotated to catch the light of the distant suns, Nate felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered with the bittersweet ache of parting. He had faced the extraordinary, stepped into a world beyond comprehension, and emerged changed. The wound that had brought her here was gone, but its impact remained etched into his own consciousness, a reminder of the fragility and resilience of life. In the end, he realized, the greatest healing comes not from medicine, but from trust, connection, and the willingness to stand beside someone in their most vulnerable moments. And for a brief, luminous time, he had done just that, bridging the impossible, and finding humanity reflected in a being from the stars.